Hey guys, this is Clinton Jeff from UnleashThePhones.com, and this is my review of the Motorola Moto Turbo. As I mentioned in my unboxing video, the Moto Turbo is the Indian version of the Moto Max, which is the international version of the Verizon Droid Turbo, which is sold in the US of A. Now Motorola has been pumping out some pretty interesting stuff lately. In fact, the Moto 360 was so good that I ended up buying one for myself, and the Moto E that I just reviewed last week is also a pretty decent phone at a very affordable price. But that being said, the Moto X from last year was a little underwhelming. Sure, it had a couple upgrades, but it just wasn't able to compete with other flagship smartphones on the same level. Which is why it was very interesting to see Verizon USA announce a new flagship Motorola phone. They called it the Droid Turbo, and it's come on down to India as the Moto Turbo. The Moto Turbo is a beast of a smartphone. There really is no better way to describe it. It boasts a 5.1-inch quad AMOLED screen, a 20 megapixel camera at the back. The entire thing is powered by a Snapdragon 805 processor, and if that wasn't enough, it has a 3900 mAh battery built in. Here's what I think about the Moto Turbo. Alright, starting with design, from the front the Moto Turbo might look a little generic, but flip it over to the back and you'll see that it is a very unique phone. There's a new ballistic nylon material that's been used in the construction of the rear panel. This results in the Moto Turbo feeling incredibly well built and very solid. In terms of build quality, this thing is built like a tank. The unit I got to review has the ballistic nylon fiber back panel, but the Turbo also comes with a metallized glass fiber material which is further reinforced by Kevlar. Of course, that version is only currently sold by Verizon USA. The Moto Turbo also comes in a black and red color, but here in India only the black ballistic nylon color is being sold. Regardless of whichever version you get, the Moto Turbo does have a very aggressive look about it. It's not quite as pronounced as the Moto X was, but the back panel and the angular design really does stand out compared to most phones nowadays. There's also a metal trim around the entire phone, and that metal trim is surrounded by a rubber-like material, which all makes the Moto Turbo feel incredibly well built. The ballistic nylon stitched pattern is not something I've seen on a phone before. It looks good and feels okay, but it does tend to catch dust fairly easily. And because it is a fabric-like material, I'm a little worried it might start fraying after a couple months of usage. Luckily, the dust issues aren't really a problem because the Moto Turbo is slightly water repellent. That is, there is a water repellent nano coating on the Moto Turbo, which should protect it against splashes, but you definitely don't want to dunk it in water. Measuring 143 by 73 by 11.2 millimeters and weighing 176 grams, the Moto Turbo is very manageable to hold and use with one hand. You might not be able to get to all corners of that screen, but the size is still pretty manageable. This is also appreciated because the Moto Turbo is longer, wider and heavier than the Moto X was. Most of the reason for that size is the large display. At the front there's a staggering 5.2-inch Quad HD 1440 by 2560 pixels resolution AMOLED display. That equals an insane pixel density of 565 ppi, which makes this one of the most pixel dense screens on a phone. The screen is glorious to behold, mostly because of how incredibly detailed it is, and no matter how close you hold the Turbo to your face, you won't be able to make out individual pixels on that display. But not everything about the screen is as impressive as pixel density. For one thing, the screen can't really get very bright, so you'll have to cup the display with your hand to make out whatever's on it when you're outside on a very sunny day. But since it's an AMOLED screen, color reproduction is pretty saturated, which you might either love or hate. All in all, it's a really nice screen. Sure, it has a couple flaws, but that insane resolution and pixel density more than makes up for it. Above the display there's the thin narrow strip that is the centrally located earpiece, and below that you'll find the front facing camera right in the center, which is pretty unique positioning. There's also an ambient light sensor and proximity sensor hidden somewhere around here. Below the display there's the usual trio of capacitive Android buttons for back, home and recent apps. Coming to the rest of the phone, at the top you'll just find the lone 3.5mm headphone jack, while at the bottom you'll find just the micro USB charging port. On the left side you'll find no ports or keys whatsoever, keeping it clean and minimalistic, while on the right side you'll find the power and screen lock button and the volume rocker button. As you've probably already noticed, there is no SIM card slot or micro SD card slot on the Moto Turbo. While there really is no micro SD card slot, the volume button actually slides out to become the SIM card tray slot. I've never actually seen the volume button become a SIM card tray before on a phone, so this is very unique. As cool as this is, I imagine if you do take out your SIM card a lot, that button might get a little bit loose. All in all, the Moto Turbo does look really unique thanks to that ballistic nylon back panel, and it also has really impressive build quality. So far, so good. Alright, let's talk about hardware. If you're watching this video, you probably already know that the Moto Turbo is an insane beast of a phone. There really is no better way to describe the specs of this phone. The Moto Turbo boasts a very formidable quad-core 2.7 GHz Qualcomm Snapdragon 805 processor with an Adreno 420 GPU and 3 GB of RAM. Then there's also the Motorola mobile computing system, which features a natural language processor and a textual computing chip as well. As such, the Moto Turbo can really handle almost anything you throw at it, and even the most intense 3D game will play just fine on this phone. In terms of benchmarks, it performed really well versus all the other competing phones out there. If you want to read up on those benchmarks, you can check out the post right over at UnleashThePhones.com. Apart from that, the Moto Turbo comes in either 32GB or 64GB versions. Since there's no microSD card slot, this is very appreciated, and here in India, only the 64GB Moto Turbo is being sold. In terms of connectivity, there's Bluetooth 4.0, AGPS, Wi-Fi, there's NFC, but there is no infrared. Alright, let's talk about software. Just like the Moto X and the Moto G and the Moto E before it, the Moto Turbo runs an almost stock version of Android. In fact, the Moto Turbo has a slight advantage over the Droid Turbo in that it's running Android 5.0 Lollipop already. All of that without any of the carrier bloatware that the Verizon version has. The stock Android experience on the Turbo is pretty much the same as what we saw on the Moto X, with a clean minimalistic interface that is very lightweight. There's the usual built-in features that come with stock Android, but there's also a couple very cool Motorola additions that aren't enough to overwhelm users. There's Moto Voice, Moto Assist, Moto Display and Moto Actions, all of which attempt to enhance your experience with the Moto Turbo. The customized voice trigger option is definitely one of my favorite features because it basically lets you choose how to activate Moto Voice. Apart from that, it's your usual stock Android experience with a home screen and an app drawer and the new Lollipop style of notification drop-down. There's also the usual amount of Google apps pre-installed, and you can always download even more apps from the Google Play Store. Coming to messaging, the Google keyboard is pretty responsive and does a really good job on that nice loud screen. As a result, typing on the Moto Turbo is very comfortable, and of course you can always install another keyboard if you want to. Coming to web browsing, that Quad HD screen really does come in handy when you're browsing the internet. Chrome on that powerful processor loads up every web page just fine. Coming to multimedia, the gallery app is the same as the one on the Moto X, where it arranges your pictures in a grid of thumbnails. There's also a very cool highlights feature, which sorts all of your pictures based on when or where it was taken, and it automatically creates a really cool little highlight video. Speaking of which, that Quad HD screen is actually really nice to watch videos on. Coming to music, the Google Play Music app handles all audio responsibilities on the Moto Turbo. It's pretty decent and has all the capabilities that you'd want in a music player. What's very interesting about the Moto Turbo is that the earpiece at the top also happens to be the loudspeaker. The first time I saw this was on the 2015 Moto E, so it's really interesting to see Motorola stick to this very cool little design. This allows them to make sure there's no ugly speaker grill anywhere else on the phone. The loudspeaker actually does a pretty good job and can get really loud without any distortion, but that being said, it isn't as loud as the loudspeaker on the LG G3 or the Galaxy S5. And I should also note that audio via the headphone jack isn't too great either. Alright, let's talk about that camera. The Moto Turbo boasts a 20.7 megapixel rear camera with an f2.0 aperture lens and a dual LED flash, and it can even record 4K resolution video. The camera UI on the Moto Turbo is pretty identical to the one on the Moto X. Most of the interface acts as a viewfinder, and swiping right gives you access to the scroll wheel. The scroll wheel gives you access to the various settings and scene modes, but there's only an HDR mode and a panorama mode. That's not as many scene modes available as some other camera apps, but Motorola does like to keep it simple. And hey, if you want more settings, you can always just download a separate camera app from the Google Play Store. In terms of image quality, I'm very happy to report that this is probably the first time in ages that I was really impressed with a camera from a Motorola phone, and that was quite the surprise considering how underwhelming the Moto X camera was. Outdoor images from the Moto Turbo were generally pleasant with rich details, well-toned colors and balanced dynamic range. As expected, quality does drop with indoor situations, but the results are still way better than what I got on the Moto X. There's a noticeable amount of visible noise that creeps into each image, and details can be rather soft, but overall it's pretty decent. That being said, panorama shots are really disappointing, being really low resolution, that is just 2 megapixels. The front-facing 2 megapixel camera does a pretty good job and is decent at capturing selfies. It doesn't have as much detail as the main camera, but it does provide more than usable results with very balanced exposure. Coming to video, the Moto Turbo can shoot video in either 4K resolution Ultra HD or in 1080p HD. Quality is pretty good at both resolutions, but not too great. Details do sometimes appear soft, and the microphone does a miserable job at recording audio, and that makes voices sound kinda subdued. As always guys, I have a whole bunch of camera samples right over at UnleashThePhones.com in case you want to see how good or how bad the Moto Turbo's camera actually was. Alrighty, let's talk about call quality. body. There's 4 microphones built in, and this in conjunction with Motorola's Crystal Talk technology does a really good job at noise cancelling when you're on a call with the Moto Turbo. Callers heard my voice loud and clear, and the Moto Turbo did a really good job at eliminating background noise completely. Network reception wasn't an issue either, but ironically, even though the earpiece is the loudspeaker, earpiece volume could have been a little bit louder. Let's move on to my favorite part about the Moto Turbo, the battery life. Yet another highlight of the Moto Turbo has to be its battery life. This thing is powered by a 3900 mAh battery, which Motorola claims can last up to 48 hours of mixed usage. That claim is a little bit generous, but I was still able to get up to a day and a half worth of moderate usage out of the Moto Turbo. Considering the specs and the screen on this phone, that is very impressive battery life. Under very heavy usage with 3G, a little bit of web browsing, about an hour of music listening, and a little bit of Instagram, Tinder, Snapchat, I was still able to get back home every day with lots of battery life left on the Moto Turbo. Under my heaviest usage, I was still able to get about 14 hours worth of battery life, which is pretty good for any normal workday. What's even more impressive is the turbo charging technology that the Moto Turbo uses. Using the turbocharger that comes in its box, I was easily able to charge this phone up from a 0 to 100%, all in just about 2 hours. Considering the size of that battery, that's pretty awesome, and that's the same amount of time the LG G3 and the Galaxy S5 takes to charge up. It's also worth noting that if you're a fan of wireless charging, the Moto Turbo does support Qi wireless charging. Alrighty, to conclude, the Moto Turbo is a spectacular phone. It's definitely not the lightest, and it probably isn't the best looking, but that ballistic nylon does make it unique enough to stand out. The build quality is really solid, and the battery life is really impressive. Heck, even that camera isn't too bad at all. Naturally, considering those specs, the price tag of this phone is kind of high. In fact, here in India, the Moto Turbo costs almost the same as the Sony Xperia Z3, which I think was the best phone of last year. It also costs the same as the LG G3 and the HTC One M8. Now, the Moto Turbo's camera isn't as good as the one on the Sony Xperia Z3, nor is the Quad HD screen as good as the Quad HD screen on the LG G3, but you have a way more powerful processor, a stock version of Android, and an incredible battery life. At the end of the day, all flagship smartphones have their own pros and cons, but I do kind of feel that the Moto Turbo does stand out among its competition. Chances are, if you do shell out that much money for this phone, you're going to be pretty darn happy with it. Definitely recommend it. Alright guys, so that's what I think about the Moto Turbo. As always, if you guys have any questions about this phone, you can let me know right in the comment section below, or check out the detailed post right over at UnleashThePhones.com. And hey, if you like this video, maybe hit the like button or maybe subscribe, because that would be appreciated. And that's about it. Thanks for watching, guys.